We have quorum, and I'll recognize myself for opening remarks. Again, I thank everyone for being accommodating with the crazy schedule we have today. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the humanitarian impact of the ongoing conflict in Syria. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses, Ms. Kadour, Mr. Lang, Ms. Schalke, and Mr. Rayburn. Thank you for joining us today. Yesterday marked the 11th anniversary of the start of the Syrian revolution, 11 years of conflict, violence, displacement, and hardship. What began with the Syrian people rising up to demand dignity, freedom, and a voice in shaping their government was met with a brutal crackdown by Bashar al-Assad, who, with the help of outside support from Iran and Russia, ushered in over a decade of conflict and aided the proliferation of global terrorism. While fighting has abated in many areas, there's still significant violence across the country, from offenses in the northwest, north, and northeast, to targeted killings, unlawful detention, and torture. Further, the humanitarian situation on the ground is dire. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs found that in 2022, 14.6 million people needed humanitarian assistance, an increase of 1.2 million people from 2021. This is coming at a time when the international community is giving less money for humanitarian programs in Syria. The U.S. and the entire international community must step up to meet the needs of the Syrian people. The struggle for the future of Syria has led to the deaths of over 500,000 Syrians and the displacement of more than 12 million. There are over 6.8 million Syrian refugees living in the region, primarily Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, and Turkey. And while many refugees have found haven abroad, the generosity of host countries is beginning to wane, and violence against refugees is on the rise. In FY21, the United States spent over $1.8 billion in humanitarian funding for the Syrian regional response alone. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how our foreign assistance is being used and how the international community and host countries can work together to ensure the safety and security of Syrian refugees, as well as to create the conditions for them to one day return to Syria if they choose. The UN estimates there are 6.7 million internally displaced people, IDPs, in Syria, 3.1 million of which are children. IDPs living in both official and informal camps often face severe overcrowding, violence, malnutrition, and lack of economic opportunity. A whole refugee camp in northwest Syria was built for 10,000 people. It now holds more than 60,000, the vast majority of whom are women and children. The camp also contains an annex that houses former ISIS supporters or affiliates. The tenuous security situation within the camp, combined with squalid living conditions, have resulted in mounting discontent, creating a breeding ground for radicalization. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses today about the conditions of refugee and IDP camps, the impact that has on terrorist radicalization and recruitment, and how NGOs, the U.S., and the international community can improve humanitarian conditions on the ground, combat extremism, and support the swift and secure repatriation of foreign nationals. From fiscal years 2012 to 2021, the U.S. spent over $14 billion responding to the Syrian humanitarian situation, all while employing severe sanctions, including through the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act on Syrian President Assad, senior Syrian government officials, and any related entities or affiliates. Nevertheless, the Assad regime has been manipulating aid for over a decade, siphoning millions of dollars from international donors and humanitarian organizations by withholding aid to opponents, channeling it to allies, and engaging in currency manipulation. I welcome thoughts from our witnesses not only on ways to improve the utilization of humanitarian exemptions to existing sanctions, but also on what NGOs, the U.S., and the international community can do to reduce Assad's leverage over humanitarian assistance. As we confront the long-term humanitarian realities of conflict in Syria, we must be steadfast in our support for assistance to the Syrian people, including recovery assistance, while also remaining vigilant in ensuring that Assad and his cronies do not benefit from the people suffering. The Assad regime's manipulation of aid further underscores the importance of cross-border aid delivery, which allows aid to be delivered directly to communities without first having to go through the regime in Damascus. Bab al-Hawa crossing on the border between Turkey and Syria is the last crossing with a UN mandate since Russia prevented the extension of 3 other aid crossings. I look forward to hearing about the necessity of Bab al-Hawa to aid operations, as well as observations and expectations leading to the reauthorization in July. Finally, we cannot forget the crimes and atrocities committed by the Assad regime, torture, murder, rape, and the use of chemical weapons against the Syrian people. The recent conviction of a former Syrian official of crimes against humanity in Germany is a strong step toward justice. We must ensure that Syrian regime officials, as well as President Assad himself, are held accountable for the heinous crimes that have been and continue to be committed. As we mark 11 years of devastating conflict, Congress and the United States stand committed to raising awareness of the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Syria, supporting the people of Syria in their quest for dignity, freedom, and opportunity. And I look forward to discussing ways that the U.S. can empower Syrians and Syrian-led organizations as well. I thank the witnesses for what I know will be a productive discussion. And with that, I will recognize Ranking Member Wilson for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutch, for your excellent comments and for calling this important hearing on Syria. Yesterday marked the 11th anniversary of the Syrian revolution against the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad. How many more Syrians will be killed until the world acts? For over a decade, the world has stood by and watched as the barbaric Assad regime and its backers in Russia and Iran indiscriminately butchered the Syrian people in order to claim the power. They have brutally killed over 500,000 Syrians, with over 13 million displaced in the country of 20 million, committed countless atrocities and perpetrated egregious war crimes. It has to be said without equivocation, Bashar al-Assad must go. There is no question and solution to the West Syria as long as the brutal Assad regime remains in power. I was grateful this week to introduce a bipartisan resolution along with our colleague, Congressman Vicente Gonzalez of Texas, calling upon the Biden administration to do more to enforce the Caesar Act and push back against efforts by many countries in the Arab world to normalize relations with this brutal and illegitimate regime. Syrian murders are a tragic example of the conflict of authoritarianism against democracy worldwide. The choice of rule of gun or rule of law, as we see happening today in Ukraine, soon Moldova and Georgia, for control, tomorrow in Taiwan for control, and next in Israel for extermination. Humanitarian considerations regarding the conflict in Syria cannot be separated from the Assad regime's brutal war against its own people. Of course, humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people is essential, but it is a terrible mistake to believe that humanitarian aid itself is a strategy to achieve justice and accountability for the people of Syria. Unfortunately, this seems to be the policy of the Biden administration, which has failed to implement the bipartisan Caesar Act sanctions in the name of humanitarian assistance and greenlighted so-called, quote, early recovery, end quote, projects in Syria, a euphemism for reconstruction projects. The administration has also ignored the plain text of the Caesar Act by facilitating energy deals that would not only directly benefit the Assad regime, but also exacerbate corruption in Lebanon. I'm also concerned by reports that the administration is seeking to implement a geographic waiver of the Caesar Act in the name of humanitarian assistance, further weakening the law. We should not be taking cues from Putin and Tehran when considering the next steps in Syria. We must clearly oppose all authoritarian dictatorships which are promoting a rule by gun instead of rule by law. In addition to the United States, we have provided over $6 billion to UN operations in Syria. While we would like to believe that the money is going to ease Syrian civilian suffering, analysts on all sides of the political spectrum have documented how much of this aid has propped up the Assad regime, which has diverted millions of dollars to entities controlled by the regime. President Obama's former ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, wrote on February 12, 2018, of the UN aid that, quote, it is clear the aid is not neutral and is being used as a weapon by the Syrian government, end of quote. In addition, the UN's procurement reports have shown the UN operations in Syria delivered millions to the Syrian Arab Army and other regime entities, as well as millions to charities co-opted by members of the Assad family, include including Bashar al-Assad's wife, Asma. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the United States can help the Syrian people through mechanisms outside of the UN process. I was grateful the last Congress to introduce the Stop UN Support for Assad Act, which would prohibit taxpayer dollars from going to UN operations in Syria so long as the UN provided assistance to the Assad regime or its cronies, and instead provide assistance directly to the Syrian people. Again, thank you for the witnesses being here. I look forward to hearing from each of you, and I'm grateful to yield back to Chairman Ted Deutch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. I will now turn to the witnesses for their testimony. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. And without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the hearing record. Thanks again for being here. I'll introduce all 4 of you before turning it over to you to make your presentations. Ms. Jomana Kadour is a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center Middle East Programs, where she leads the Syria portfolio and is a member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee as part of the Civil Society Group. She is the co-founder of Syria Relief and Development, a humanitarian organization working in northwest Syria that has implemented over $120 million worth of aid, as well as a doctoral student at the Georgetown University Law Center. Mr. Hardin Lang is the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International and is a veteran of 6 UN peacekeeping and humanitarian field missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Guatemala, Haiti, and Mali. Before joining Refugees International, Hardin was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he specialized in Middle East conflicts and national security policy, as well as a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Nirvana Schalke is the Regional Director for CARE's Middle East and North Africa region, where she leads humanitarian response and development programming across 11 countries. She has 2 decades of experience working in the Middle East in multiple roles in diverse fields like academia, media, advocacy, and campaigning. She has also led global efforts to mitigate humanitarian crises in the MENA region with a focus on international humanitarianism and the protection of civilians in conflicts. And finally, Mr. Joel Rayburn is a fellow focusing on Middle East issues at the New America Foundation, as well as the Hoover Institution, and is currently writing a history of the Syrian conflict. He was the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria from 2018 to 2021 and served for 26 years as a U.S. Army officer across the world, with his final assignment as the Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon on the National Security Council staff in 2017, 2018, and we thank you for your service. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each, and Ms. Kadour, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak at today's hearing. My name is Jomana Kadour, and I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'm here to speak solely on my own behalf. I'm heartened by your decision to hold a hearing focused on Syria, which remains a singular source of conflict and instability, despite newer instances of war dominating the headlines. As images of Ukraine rightfully captivate international attention, Syria watchers are reminded painfully of the conflict we have seen unfold over the last 11 years. Images of a bombed maternity hospital in Mariupol recall the 601 medical facilities destroyed in Syria, 542 of those destroyed by Russian and Syrian government attacks. Today, there is a slow deterioration of conditions and quality of life for all Syrians except those close to Assad and his inner circle. 97% of Syrians live under the poverty line, even though $2.27 billion worth of UN aid was distributed across the country last year. This has done little to offset the needs, however, given the Syrian government's chokehold over humanitarian aid operations and their manipulation of all aspects of the humanitarian response. Each year, humanitarian organizations operating in North Syria are annually threatened by a UN Security Council vote by Russia to cut off all cross-border aid in an attempt to pressure donors to send all aid through Damascus. Russia has also tried to press strictly for cross-line deliveries from Damascus to North Syria, but over the last 8 months, it has only permitted 2 cross-line deliveries to the northwest, which is wholly insufficient. We see a similar predicament in northeast Syria since the Yarubia crossing was shut down in 2019. There, the government holds all aid to the northeast hostage by restricting and limiting access for UN funding to loyalist supporters rather than credible local NGOs. Northeast, Northwest, and government-held Syria all have varying needs. Northwest Syria is home to at least 3 million civilians, 80% of which have been displaced more than 6 times. It's also the site of consistent attacks, despite a delicate, often violated ceasefire forged by the Astana process. According to the White Helmets, the Syrian and Russian governments perpetuated at least 1,500 attacks in 2021 alone. The predicament of Northwest Syria is further complicated by the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the strongest military group in the area. Although the group allows humanitarian operations with limited intervention, local governance entities, education centers, women's facilities, and activists are often treated with hostility, threats, closures, and violence. Meanwhile, international diaspora and local NGOs managing programs in Northwest Syria struggle to operate as budgets for international aid decrease. Stabilization funding to the Northwest Syria remains also extremely limited, placing undue burden on humanitarian organizations with limited mandates to promote governance and strategic development services in the area. The next generation also continues to suffer the consequences of short-term aid policy in Syria. Local organizations operating in this sector struggle as the criteria for what donors are willing to fund continues to narrow. Funding is almost exclusively limited to primary education, and even that is short-term in length and prevents any long-term planning, meaning children don't have access to stable education programs or higher education, and even fewer have access to actual school buildings due to systematic and ongoing attacks on such buildings by Russian and Syrian regime forces. In government-controlled areas, the economic situation has undergone unprecedented decline as corruption schemes monopolize the Syrian economy, cutting out average Syrians and instead enriching select members of Assad's elite circle and his military patrons, Iran and Russia. Compounding the economic challenges, mass flight of Syria's young population is ongoing due to arbitrary arrests, intimidation, conscription, lack of job opportunities, and the flight of business people and former loyalists who see no future in a highly securitized and corrupt state. The collapse of the Syrian pound and Lebanese banking crisis have depressed and devastated things further. Today, the Russian war on Ukraine also increases the likelihood of famine and starvation, given Russia has canceled its wheat contracts with Syria, which in recent years has come to account for 25% of Syria's wheat. Damascus also maintains a chokehold over UN operations with resulting limits on monitoring and evaluation, procurement, and hiring. Although the UN is not subject to US and EU sanctions and therefore can work with sanctioned actors, it is nonetheless required by its own supplier code of conduct to, quote, support and respect the protection of internationally proclaimed human rights and to ensure that they are not complicit in human rights abuses. The US is the largest contributor to UN humanitarian operations worldwide and therefore has a central role to play in seeking accountability of these funds. Next, in Northeast Syria, home to 3 million people located in an area with small but critical US military presence, 1.8 million people need humanitarian assistance and 630,000 remained in IDP camps. Grim environmental conditions decrease agricultural production and waterborne diseases. Security in Northeast Syria remains tenuous as the Islamic State attempts to revive its presence and secure resources. Further, genuine social cohesion issues are rampant in areas held by the Syrian Democratic Forces due to marginalization of Arab communities and tribes amongst political and military leadership, which has inadvertently allowed the Islamic State to exploit social rifts. Finally, let me speak briefly about Rukban, located near a 10th military base, which hosts US forces. The proximity of Rukban to the nearby US base prevents the regime and its allies from exterminating the camp's 10,000 residents, but also includes 6,000 children. The government has denied entry to humanitarian convoys since 2019. Let me end by providing some recommendations. First, ensure that the UN humanitarian operations continue in Northwest Syria this July when the UN cross-border resolution comes up for renewal, even if the US and its allies must consider an alternative plan to ensure crossing into Northwest and Northeast Syria. Given broader tensions with Russia over Ukraine, an independent approach may be needed in concert with partners like Turkey. Second, the US government should lead in ensuring that accountability is integrated into global humanitarian policy, including effective audits for UN funding. Third, ensure that early recovery aid and stabilization aid, a crucial part of this administration's strategy, benefits all areas of Syria. Fourth, encourage carving out exemptions from economic sanctions in Northeast Syria if we are to make it prosperous and stable. Fifth, education should be a key priority for all donors across all contexts in Syria, including primary, secondary, and higher education programming. Sixth, the US government should lead legal efforts to ensure assets seized from Russian officials as a result of the Ukraine war sanctions be allocated to rebuild and restore areas outside of government-held Syria, given they too have suffered from Russian military attacks. Seventh, financially support Syrian diaspora organizations like the American Relief Coalition for Syria, which has implemented about $1 billion worth of aid programs, given their strong connections to both Syrians and Americans. Finally, ensure humanitarian aid to civilians in Rukban and facilitate their passage to North Syria as they have requested. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kadour. Mr. Way, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, and Ranking Member Wilson and members of the subcommittee for holding today's hearing on Syria. At a time when so many other crises are absorbing public attention, your decision to spotlight the war on its 11th anniversary is to be commended. My remarks will focus on the plight of Syrian refugees in the region. For years, the United States has played a leading role in providing life-saving assistance to Syria's displaced. Refugees International has seen this firsthand in our work. Syria remains the single largest displacement crisis in the world. Some 6 million Syrians continue to seek refuge abroad, and more than 6 million people are displaced internally. Neighboring countries have borne most of the responsibility. Turkey ranks as the world's largest refugee hosting country, while Lebanon and Jordan host the most refugees per capita. Inside Syria, violence may have fallen, but areas of the country are still contested. The ceasefire in Idlib remains fragile, as is the situation in the northeast. In areas controlled by the Assad regime, returning refugees face grave human rights abuses and persecution. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that few Syrians are going home. Last year, only about 36,000 did so. At the same time, however, Syrians are facing increased pressure to return. Resources and infrastructure in host countries are strained, and so is the domestic political will to sustain refugees. The COVID-19 pandemic has only made the situation more acute. Recent trends give cause for concern. Turkey has deported refugees to Syria and threatened to send millions back into a safe zone along the border. In Lebanon, Syrians are evicted, arrested, and occasionally deported. And Jordan is refusing to provide refuge or aid to Syrians living in desperate conditions just across the border in Rukban camp, as we heard earlier. Most urgently, Russia will probably veto the UN cross-border aid into resolution into northwest Syria this June, or July, and the consequences for millions of displaced Syrians will be catastrophic. The hard truth is that Syrian refugees remain caught between a rock and a hard place, unable to go home, but facing tough conditions in their host communities. Meaningful resettlement remains an aspiration. The bottom line is that integrating the refugees into their host countries, society, and economy offers the most viable, safe, and dignified pathway forward for the time being. To this end, the United States and other donors should take 10 steps to support both refugees and host communities in the region. First, the United States should encourage Turkey and Lebanon to comply with international law and stop forcing Syrian refugees back into Syria. UNHCR should be allowed to monitor removal centers to ensure that all returns to Syria are voluntary, and the UN should also demand access and closely monitor the condition of the few refugees who are actually returning to Syria. Second, the United States should encourage donors to ensure multi-year funding to the formal education sector in host countries. It should also support non-formal education in camps and informal settlements to help fill gaps. Third, the United States should redouble efforts to improve conditions for women refugees. Programs should provide childcare, address gender-based violence, and offer vocational trainings for jobs that empower women as members of society. Fourth, and this is important, donors must promote labor market integration. More jobs for refugees are essential to making them self-reliant. A joint research project by RI and the Center for Global Development has shown that labor market integration is an economic win-win for refugees and their hosts alike. Fifth, the United States should channel more resources to local aid groups. The goal here should be to allocate a quarter of U.S. funding over the next 4 years in line with USAID's new commitment. The shift is particularly urgent in Lebanon, where government corruption is a major concern. Sixth, the United States should adopt a holistic approach to Lebanon. As this committee well knows, the country's economic and political crisis is deepening by the day. Aid for Syrians, while urgent, must be integrated into a comprehensive strategy to meet the needs of refugees and host communities alike. Seventh, donors must fund the UN Regional Refugee Plan. Last year, only 28% of the UN Refugee Response Plan in the region was funded. And as of this morning, funding for this year's plan received amounted to zero. The United States should mobilize other donors, particularly the Gulf, to close the gap. Eighth, the United States must work with Jordan to find solutions to the Rukban crisis. Negotiations over the 5-year Memorandum of Understanding and its renewal with Jordan offer an opportunity to make progress. Ninth, the United States has resettled just over 23,000 refugees from Syria to date. That is a drop in the bucket. RI is deeply aware of the overall stress on the U.S. resettlement system, but we can and should resettle at least 15,000 Syrians each year for the next 4 years in concert and compliance with the presidential PD. And finally, we must urgently prepare for the scenario in which Russia vetoes the UN cross-border aid resolution in July of this year. We can discuss more of that in the question and answer. I will stop there. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
And thank you very much, Mr. Lang. Appreciate it. Ms. Schalke, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Deutch, Mr. Ranking Member, subcommittee members. Thank you for this opportunity to examine the humanitarian impact of the 11 years of conflict in Syria. My name is Nirvana Shawqi. I am the Regional Director for CARE in the Middle East and North Africa. And I have been working on the Syria crisis in multiple mandates since the beginning of the crisis. CARE implements humanitarian and development programs in over 100 countries with a focus on women and girls, who are the most vulnerable in crisis situations, but also the most powerful change makers. CARE responds to the Syria crisis directly and through partners in Syria and neighboring countries. And since 2013, we have reached more than 9 million people inside Syria alone. Simply put, humanitarian needs are increasing while diplomacy and support are decreasing. Alongside life-saving aid, Syrians need longer-term, sustainable assistance that builds their self-reliance and resilience. This includes durable solutions to displacement, mitigating the impacts of climate change like recurrent drought and harsher winters, addressing the ways gender inequalities compound humanitarian needs, and investing in locally led solutions. Above all, support for Syria must not be politicized, and while humanitarian access or early recovery support is a long-standing pillar of the humanitarian response in Syria, Syrian people cannot afford for it to be used as a political bargaining chip. The severity of needs after 11 years of war are compounded by multiple crises: economic collapse, food insecurity, water scarcity, and the global pandemic. CARE's recent rapid gender analysis reveals that the households are under immense duress across northern Syria. In the northwest, where 97% of the population lives on less than $2 a day, women reported domestic violence as a major concern. In the northeast, that was Syria's breadbasket, has now been devastated by drought. 25% of households eat 1 meal a day, and 1 in 5 children are malnourished. Families are resorting to negative coping mechanisms like eliminating meat and fruits and vegetables and all nutritious elements, selling farmlands and animals, begging and borrowing, sending their children to work, and marrying off young daughters to older men. The reality is grim, and we are preparing for further deterioration. Cross-border humanitarian access, a fundamental lifeline, has been eroded, and the last authorized crossing into northwest Syria is at risk again if the UN Security Council Resolution 2585 expires in July. Additionally, the devastating situation on the ground is really the devastating situation with the conflict in Ukraine may well have dire impacts on global supply chains, intensifying food insecurity places like Syria and Lebanon, while further straining diplomatic efforts. The US commitment to prioritize humanitarian needs within its Syria strategy is very welcome, but this must be backed up with meaningful resources. Syrians cannot eat promises or shelter their families with words alone. Last year, humanitarian actors were forced to cut vital health services and food rations due to the lack of funding. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, CARE urges Congress and the administration to support additional funding for life-saving aid, early recovery, and resilience activities in Syria. We hope your offices will support a substantial increase of the top-line humanitarian accounts next fiscal year to respond at scale to growing global needs. But aid alone is not enough. This must be complemented by concerted diplomacy towards an inclusive political solution. CARE urges US leaders to put renewed focus on international humanitarian cooperation, including the continuity of UN Security Council Resolution 2585 for another 12-month at a minimum. The Syrian people need policymakers to be united in support of their access to basic needs. Finally, CARE recommends increased direct funding to Syrian-led NGOs, particularly women-focused organizations. Local solutions are the most enduring, and CARE is honored to be invited to testify, and I'm very pleased to see my colleague Jumana here today as a witness, but we must do more to engage and empower Syrians to defend their own path forward. The Syrian crisis, while exceptionally dire in many ways, is sadly not unique. This crisis is symbolic of a chronic lack of humanitarian resourcing and diplomacy globally. But with these steps, we have an opportunity to reverse these trends in Syria while setting a new humanitarian course worldwide. To mark the end of the 11th year of the crisis, CARE spoke to 11-year-old Syrian girls, all born the year the crisis started. I will let Atiyah, a refugee in Lebanon, have the final word to you, sir. Even though we have been here for a long time, we are different. Our accent is different. I feel different from everyone else. I am not in my country, and when you are somewhere else, you never feel really safe. My parents say Syria was beautiful, that it was a good place to live. Sometimes people ask me, why am I still here? Why I don't go home? And I want to shout, why don't you understand? My country is destroyed. Where do you want me to go? I have nowhere to go. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, thank you for your time and attention today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schalke, for your testimony. And finally, Mr. Rayburn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Deutch and Mr. Wilson, and I commend the committee for bringing oversight to U.S. policy on the worsening humanitarian crisis in Syria. The first thing to understand about this problem is that it is a symptom of a bigger one, which is Bashar al-Assad's continuing war against the Syrian population enabled by Vladimir Putin. For Assad, starvation is a strategy of war, so the only way truly to stop humanitarian suffering in Syria is to compel Assad and Putin to cease their warfare and accept a political resolution of the conflict. Thus far, the Biden administration has chosen instead to focus on symptoms of Assad and Putin's war rather than the war itself. The Biden team proposed late last year to focus on terrorism, humanitarian deliveries, and local ceasefires, but they've done so in a way that's disconnected from any effort to resolve the broader conflict that creates these issues or to pressure Assad and Putin to stop. The administration also signaled a green light for Israel to attack Iranian weapons in Syria, but without addressing Iran's military expansion in the Levant more broadly. And indeed, this afternoon, we see reports that the administration may soon lift the foreign terrorist designation from Iran's IRGC, a dangerous step that could allow money to flow back into the IRGC's terror networks and Assad's war machine and make the Syrian crisis even worse. The previous administration, of course, had a different approach of bringing severe pressure on Assad and his allies, especially through sanctions, to compel them to accede to the UN-sponsored political process and cease attacks against civilians. But in 2021, the administration effectively discontinued this pressure and sanctions slackened. The administration instead made gestures to Russia to secure Moscow's vote to extend the UN mandate for cross-border aid deliveries. But while US representatives were negotiating with Russian counterparts about ensuring UN aid deliveries to northern Syria, the Russian Air Force was bombing civilians in those same areas, making a mockery of the negotiations, unfortunately. So in my view, this current US approach of treating symptoms rather than causes can't work. Absent much greater pressure, Assad will not end his war against his own people, and the humanitarian catastrophe, refugee crisis, and terrorism that his war creates will continue ad infinitum. But Assad also can't win the war, even with a blank check from Putin. 11 years without an Assad victory is long enough for us to reach that conclusion, and that means Congress can still make a difference in Syria. So I recommend you press for several policy changes in the United States. First, mobilize international pressure to force Assad and Putin into complying with UN Security Council Resolution 2254, and discard all illusions about constructive engagement with the Russians on this issue for now. The Russians are not interested in partnering with us to get a stable, acceptable outcome in Syria. The horrific tactics they're employing in Ukraine, indiscriminately bombing civilians, rubbling cities, cutting off essential services, these are all methods that they practiced and continue to practice in Syria to this day. Most recently, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu announced his intention of recruiting 16,000 Syrians to be flung into the war in Ukraine. So Moscow is exporting the Syrian war, not de-escalating. And second, to this end, I think the United States should restore sanctions pressure immediately. With Putin's destabilizing behavior in Europe, there's no reason to go easy on his top Middle Eastern client just for the sake of creating a friendlier atmosphere with Moscow. Regain leverage for the good of the situation both in Syria and Ukraine by reinstating the intense pace of Caesar-related sanctions from 2020, including against Russians as the Caesar Act envisioned. Third, Congress should also discourage the administration from continuing with the misguided idea of having the regional countries send gas across Assad's territory to supposedly assist the Lebanese energy sector. There are better alternatives that wouldn't violate the Caesar Act and wouldn't give Assad a windfall, as that one. Fourth, scrutinize international assistance flowing through Damascus, especially the ways in which the Assad regime manipulates and intimidates the UN agencies there. Make U.S. aid conditional on much greater transparency about how aid deliveries are conducted and by whom. Fifth, and this is one that hasn't yet been taken up by Congress, crack down on Assad's vast narco-trafficking operations that generate billions of dollars in revenue each year for the regime. Denying Assad and his Hezbollah partners this revenue would deal a body blow to both of them and make international pressure much more effective. Sixth, encourage the U.S. government to support criminal prosecutions against Syrian war criminals, as the Germans have started to do. And just today in the New York Times, for example, we saw a major article on mass graves of thousands of Syrian detainees being detected in Syria. So this issue is going to become more prominent. Seventh, and finally, press the administration to appoint a senior diplomat with a direct line to State Department leadership to conduct this diplomacy. The administration inexplicably has not appointed a special envoy for Syria for the first time since 2014, and our allies and partners have taken that as a sign that we're not interested. Since 2011, as the chairman mentioned, the United States has spent more than $14 billion on humanitarian assistance for Syrians. The EU has spent $25 billion during that time, Canada $3.5 billion. Turkey claims to have spent $40 billion of its own, and when you throw in the costs for refugee hosting states such as Jordan and Lebanon, you can see that the cost of humanitarian response for the Syrian crisis is approaching $100 billion. But that $100 billion has not done much by itself, and it won't. The next $100 billion won't either unless it's part of a comprehensive strategy to resolve the cause of the conflict rather than its symptoms, by bringing all tools to bear to compel Assad and Putin to end their war against the Syrian people once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rayburn. Next, I'll recognize members for 5 minutes each. And pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know. We'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will defer my time and start by recognizing Mr. Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Wilson for holding today's hearing on this really important issue, and thank you to our witnesses for their excellent testimony. Ms. Schalke, I want to begin with you. As we watched the horrific atrocities being committed by President Assad and his government, I first want to say thank you for the difficult work that you're doing to help U.S. aid reach Syrians in need, while at the same time ensuring it never reaches the hands of those in the Assad regime. And that's always a concern, I think, as we fight for additional resources. So can you please describe for us in greater detail the extensive checks and screening mechanisms that are in place to ensure that any humanitarian programs in the region-controlled areas are not used to benefit the regime?
Thank you, sir. And I mean, in CARE, we are very grateful for the support of the United States in helping us provide the support to the Syrian people. Allow me to provide also my testimony in further details in writing. We apply the highest measures of internal controls to ensure that the vetting process is in line with the U.S. standards for implementation. And while we deliver our assistance directly in most areas, we also work with Syrian organizations on the ground through a very scrutinized vetting process to ensure that they cover all the checks and balances that are ensuring that there is no aid diversion, that the aid is directly reaching the hands of the beneficiaries, and we ensure that our reporting mechanisms are of the highest standards to verify all these different processes. I, sir, will ask my team also to provide you in writing and the esteemed committee all the different details about our checks and balances to ensure the highest monitoring of our operations. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That would be very helpful, and appreciate you furnishing that. Mr. Lang, thank you again for your testimony. I'd like to focus for a moment on the Al Hol refugee camp, which, as you know, was built to house approximately 10,000 people, but has housed more than 60,000 people since the caliphate fell over 3 years ago, and the vast majority of whom are women and children who fled ISIS-controlled territories. And reports continue to be seen that demonstrate that the conditions remain quite squalid at Al Hol from a variety of NGOs. And over the past 2 years, children in particular have been living in really horrific conditions. In addition, obviously, the security situation is being monitored closely, but presents real problems. Last month, ISIS-affiliated women tried to kidnap Kurdish guards that were patrolling the camp, leading to a shooting in which a 10-year-old child was killed and several women and children were wounded. And so would you please describe the current humanitarian situation at Al Hol and what concerns continued radicalization and deterioration of conditions in these camps present to your organization's work and to our objective and mission broadly?
Thank you, Congressman, for the excellent question. The first thing I should say is I have not been into Northeast Syria since the beginning of the pandemic. So my sort of personal knowledge of the situation at Al Hol will be slightly dated. That said, when I was in the area last, the conditions were already deteriorating pretty extraordinarily. What you say, your description is quite accurate in terms of the conditions inside the camp. The sense that, this sort of intersection of this very, very poor security situation, very limited access to humanitarian assistance moving in, very challenging working conditions for those NGOs that are providing assistance, and no real horizon, right, about how we're going to get out of this. And I think, to me, one of the things that really sort of holds forth as a North Star to try to solve the situation is we really do need to be working as hard as we possibly can with other countries who have nationals in Al Hol to work the process of getting them out. Humanitarians and then the Kurdish forces in the region can only do so much in terms of providing humanitarian assistance and then security over time. If there isn't some sort of pathway in which there is some sort of opportunity for people to leave the camp, those who need to be taken back into other sort of conditions in countries of origin, those governments need to move forward in that process, and they need to be pressured to do so. Otherwise, we don't see much of a resolution to this process. Next door in Iraq, we have seen some people begin to go back. However, the conditions in terms of access to justice, what's happening to them when they do, all that remains less than transparent. So I think we have some work to do with respect to the member states that could be doing more to get their nationals out of that, even as we try to do our best through some assistance to Kurdish allies, but then also, importantly, humanitarian organizations to try to keep their finger in the dike of the current situation. But the bottom line is the situation is extremely difficult. It hasn't been made any easier by the fact that there is no longer cross-border access for humanitarian assistance via UN mechanism into Northeast Syria. All assistance now has to go through sort of bilateral and NGO methodologies, which are challenging and which limits the aid that can get in. So that said, I think our first and top priority really is diplomatic pressure on other countries to work the issue of getting their nationals out of Al Hol. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cipollini. Mr. Allred, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to hear from our distinguished panel and confronting the humanitarian crisis in Syria. I want to build off of what Mr. Cipollini was saying and discuss women and children who've been particularly vulnerable to violence and during the 11 years of war in Syria, as the price of basic needs have skyrocketed and infrastructure has been destroyed. According to the UN, 6.1 million children require humanitarian assistance. and 3.1 million children are internally displaced. Moreover, an additional 2.5 million Syrian refugee children have been forced out of school, and an additional 1.6 million are at risk of dropping out. And the toll on women has also been particularly brutal, and gender-based violence remains a very serious concern. And so I want to be given to you, Ms. Schalke, can you please describe the specific challenges women and children have faced during 11 years of conflict in Syria, and how, and if each of you could describe how your organizations have prioritized them in your aid efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Aller. Allow me to say that this is really a great question, and we really thank you for that. And as the crisis continues to have a gendered impact, with women and girls paying the high price, and children, of course, paying the high price due to harmful and discriminatory norms and gender norms that are prevailing and widespread, the gender-based violence, including early and forced marriages, are really in the rise. And since the beginning of the conflict, people's options to survive diminish. Families are making increasingly desperate choices to survive. And for many children, this means that they cannot continue their education, but instead they are taken out of school to help contribute to the family income. And for many girls, parents see child marriage as the only option to feed their children. CARE has recently conducted a rapid gender analysis in Northwest Syria and Northeast Syria between December 2021 and February 2022. Among the key findings in this analysis, that in order to cope, families have resorted to reducing food, selling assets, child labor and marriage, and increasing household debt. 53 of the respondents reported reducing food intake to ensure children are well fed. And 1 in 5 children faces malnutrition in northern Syria, and pregnant and lactating women are at risk due to nutritional deficiencies. Also, parents reported increasing psychological stress due to feeling unable to feed their children and risks to their health and safety. And in Northwest Syria, domestic violence was women's highest security concern. And in 2020, 1 in 5 suicide attempts and deaths in Northwest Syria were by children. The worst drought, allow me to add that the worst drought in decades has led to significant harvest and income losses of over 70% of farmers in Northeast, and disproportionately affecting women who are the majority of the farming workforce. And the costs of buying water alone accounted for about 1/5 or more of the budget of 27% of the households. CARE has been actually engaging and working on all different fronts, both in Northwest Syria and Northeast Syria, to ensure that we are providing support against gender-based violence, and we are providing also support against for increased accountability in the collection and the analysis and the consistent application of age, sex, and diversity aggregated data. We also are addressing the gendered impact of shifting social roles in Syria by increasing engagement of men and boys in psychological support and gender-based violence prevention and response, and the strategies to increase women's voice in the public sphere. And also we are working on with local organizations to ensure that we are responding to the immediate needs for the families and households that are suffering the most on the ground. I defer the rest of my time to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. And if also, Ms. Kadour, if in your response, if you could also add anything you think that the U.S. and the international community should be doing to increase attention and support in this area, please add that as well.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. No, I mean, I echo Ms. Schalke's statements about the vulnerability of women and children. You know, as I mentioned, the American Relief Coalition for Syria represents 10 Syrian American humanitarian organizations, and these organizations, to varying degrees, have been working with local, especially local leaders, including local women and others, to really craft programs that are based on the kinds of needs that women and children in various parts of Syria need, right? Because as I mentioned, each part of Syria needs different kind of attention depending on its different access to aid and what type of aid. Unfortunately, and something that we'd really like to underline is that, due to the increased number of crises across the world and the COVID-19 pandemic, the aid to these areas is constantly dropping, and we're constantly having to shut down programs. And unfortunately, the need is not decreasing with that decrease in aid. Unfortunately, it's an inverse relationship. And we're seeing, as I said, more programs that are, there's a plethora of short-term programs, but not enough in terms of long-term and more stable planning. I am hopeful that the early recovery aid that was passed last July might be an opportunity. This might be an opportunity to increase more stable programming, especially as it pertains to women and children. It's still incredibly limited, however, in Northwest Syria, and that's something that we absolutely need to prioritize, is allocating stabilization and early recovery funding for Northwest Syria, where the need is incredibly high and dramatic.
Well, thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for having this hearing, which is so important as we discuss the 11th anniversary of the Syrian revolution, resulting in such a level of mass murder. Additionally, we really see that we're in a worldwide conflict of rule of law, which is opposed by authoritarians who propose rule of gun. In Syria, we've seen over 500,000 people killed, 13 million displaced, and we see it continuing with Putin following the Aleppo model to conduct the tactic of mass murder of as many civilians as possible. And sadly, this is the beginning for him to go from Ukraine to then go to Moldova, control of the Republic of Georgia. And then sadly, it's also a model for the Chinese Communist Party for the taking over of Taiwan, and then encouragement to Tehran to proceed with their death to Israel with the concept of terminating the people of Israel. And Mr. Rayburn, on November 24th, the Biden administration issued a license for early recovery in Syria. And sadly, early recovery is a euphemism which is used by dictators for reconstruction. What are your thoughts on this license?
Well, Mr. Wilson, I think the idea of early recovery is reconstruction and subsidy of the Assad regime by stealth. That is the way that, especially given the way the Assad regime has such extensive control over contracting, over the construction sector, the infrastructure in Syrian regime territory. The entire Syrian government is a worse mafia than the New York and New Jersey crime families. So any significant project that takes place anywhere in regime-controlled territory is going to be an Assad mafia project. It's going to be channeled into their pocket.
And that is so concerning and needs to be addressed. And in fact, what are the specific examples of the Biden administration failing to implement the bipartisan Caesar Act?
I think first, Mr. Wilson, the administration has just stopped issuing the sanctions. In the first 6 months of the Caesar Act, from June to December of 2020, we issued more than 100 designations under the Caesar Act and other Syria-related authorities. And then in 2021, that flow just dried up, even though there were many, many more sanctions targets that were on our radar screen and that I think should have been sanctioned, but that pressure just stopped. Is that was a move by the Biden administration to relieve some pressure on Assad in order to get Russian acquiescence to the cross-border UN mandate.
Very, very sad. And then I was really grateful a couple of years ago to be working with the former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Elliott Engel of New York, to work with U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, the irresponsible and virtually insane to me Iran JCPOA, the Iran deal. And we should learn that the last time that there was an agreement providing billions of dollars, some in cash, to the mullahs in Tehran who proclaimed proudly, death to America, death to Israel. With this, Iran immediately provided $1 billion credit line to the Assad regime and sent thousands of fighters to help carry out the atrocities against the people of Syria. What if there's another deal reached, and sadly we hear that it is to be negotiated on behalf of the United States by Putin, which is somewhat inconceivable, but that's what's going on today. And it's just in Vienna, it's just, it's so dangerous for the people of America, for the people of Israel, for our Arab allies throughout the region. And this is at the same time that Iran is conducting every effort to develop missile delivery, ICBMs. There's only one reason for an ICBM. They already have missile capability to strike Italy, to strike Romania, Bulgaria, India, and obviously they can strike Israel. But ICBMs have only one purpose, and that is to deliver a nuclear weapon against the people of the United States. With that in mind, what do you see if there's a repeat of the flawed agreement?
Well, we don't have to guess, Congressman, because we've seen it before. In the first 2 years under the JCPOA, 2016 and 2017, we know because President Rouhani revealed to us the Iranian budget. We saw that in those first 2 years of sanctions relief under the JCPOA, the Iranian regime's military and security budget increased by more than 40%. And a hugely disproportionate portion of the windfall that they got from sanctions relief went to their terror networks, missile development, IRGC, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, and the Houthis, and so on. The same thing will happen again, and I think it'll increase the conflict that's raging, that threatens to rage across the Middle East right now, and it'll be a severe threat, increased risk to an Iranian threat against Israel from both Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen.
And it would certainly reinforce the Hamas in Gaza and the incredible situation of rocket attacks from Gaza by Hamas, and then the rocket attacks of Hezbollah from Lebanon, all provided by Iran. And so I really hope the American people will be in touch with their members of the U.S. House and U.S. Senate to let them know that an Iran deal is not in the interest of world peace, and what would work is peace through strength. And so I'm grateful again for your testimony, and then I'm really grateful that Chairman Ted Deutch has returned, and thank goodness he brought Congressman Brad Schneider with him. And so as I conclude, I yield back to the High Honorable Chairperson.
Thank you to the ranking member. Chairperson, yes, high and honorable. I appreciate coming from you. I am now pleased to yield 5 minutes to Ms. Manning for her questions.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, for holding this very important hearing. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Ms. Kadour, you mentioned that the prospects for a renewed cross-border aid resolution are threatened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And assuming that Russia will veto the cross-border aid mechanism, what does an alternative system of aid delivery look like?
Thank you, Congresswoman. For several years now, actually, the Syrian organizations, along with a lot of donor, some of the donors and INGOs have tried to develop a plan B. The details of that are still developing, but our understanding is there is absolutely a way to go through Turkey in order to deliver that aid and to possibly, create a pooled funding system that countries like ours could contribute to and could oversee. Now, the UN, unfortunately, the good thing is that what the UN provides is an umbrella that protects all different kinds of organizations as they operate. I mean, the role of the UN is absolutely critical, and we do not want to lose that cross-border. But if it were to be lost, there is absolutely ways to coordinate with OCHA, with WHO, which is doing an amazing job inside of Northwest Syria, but allow, you know, non-UN entities to be able to get that aid inside, hopefully directed, you know, outside by UN organizations and entities. But the details of those, my understanding is they're being developed by donors, INGOs, and local organizations that are very worried about this prospect come July.
Thank you. And Mr. Lang, you said you had some suggestions for dealing with Russia's veto on the cross-border aid. Can you add those?
Thank you, Congressman. It would be a pleasure. Look, first and foremost, we should do everything we can in our diplomatic power to see the resolution renewed for access into Northwest Syria. Jumana is right. The plan B will not be anywhere close to the current operation in terms of the ability to get humanitarian assistance inside. All that said, this last exercise over the last couple of years, every time we go through this, the kind of concessions that are extracted by the Russians increase. And I would say that given what's happening in Ukraine and watching the posture of the Russians in the Security Council over the last couple of weeks, I think it is fair to say that we are in for a very rough ride come July. So I think planning for a plan B is pretty much what we have moving forward. And there, I think Jumana's put her finger on a number of key points. First, you know, the pooled fund that the UN uses to get assistance in, we need an alternative to this. And there is some discussion about certain donors being able to create such a mechanism to hold that money. And so I think getting an alternative to the pooled fund will be a first order priority. Second, the UN plays an incredibly important role, not just in terms of getting stuff across the border, but in terms of coordination. And so we're going to have to build a coordination mechanism that can step in and do some of that. That is going to be a difficult and challenging task, but I think it can be done. And I think it may be possible to keep the UN at least in a transition phase, moving out of if the resolution is vetoed, I think the UN can go into a transition moment where it helps to build up and hand off some sort of transition coordination role to NGOs that are left behind. There's been tremendous pressure on NGOs, international NGOs in Turkey with respect to their aid operation. And so I think we're going to need some diplomatic pressure from the US government vis-a-vis the Turkish government to the extent it's possible, or outreach, try to facilitate sort of the expansion of some of the international NGO operations in southern Turkey, which will need to pick up some of the slack. However, the most important element of this, sorry, please.
I just wanted to because I have limited time, I want to move on to another issue. What is the most significant thing you think the United States, along with its allies and partners, can do to support the long-term resettlement of Syrian refugees in light of the distant possibility that they could actually return successfully to Syria?
Great. So the last thing I would say is, just on the last question, prioritizing assistance to local NGOs really is the heart of the matter. They are the ones who do the hard work every day on the ground in Northwest Syria, and they are the essential part of the solution. So getting more aid to them and starting that now is critical. With respect to resettlement, we have a couple of engines that do this. One, the US, I do think, can step up and do a little bit more and set an example in terms of resettling more Syrian refugees. Two, in the regions, really arrangements like the Jordan Compact, right, where you trade assistance and economic access, trade access to Europe, for example, for access for Syrian refugees to the workforce, to the labor market. That sort of like getting a job makes Syrians self-sufficient with dignity, and is perhaps one of the most important things we can do in terms of expanding their access to the labor market in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. In Lebanon, it's going to be very, very hard given where we are economically, but I would put a real priority on labor market integration and also continued education. And whether that's done through the formal system or informally, we need to give Syrian children some light at the end of the tunnel on their future.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Schneider for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thanks to our witnesses for joining us today. It's hard to fathom that we're 11 years into the brutal Syrian conflict, and the U.S. Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has found that humanitarian needs in Syria are increasing as donor countries are giving less money in foreign assistance. That was noted in the materials in preparation for this hearing. While the violence may be at a lull in Syria, the economic stress and situation is at its worst. In his February report, the UN Secretary General stated that cross-border operations are a vital lifeline to ensure that aid reaches the millions of Syrians desperately in need. I'd also like to mention that the UN estimates that there are 12 million people in Syria that are considered to be food insecure. I share these snapshots of the reality Syrians face because of the dire humanitarian situation. It's something that's not improving, and so many Syrians are dependent on this vital assistance. There are many conflicts across the globe, and we have to do more to help people wherever they're in need. But in Syria, the suffering under the Assad regime cannot be forgotten. And so, to that end, a number of questions. I actually spoke to a friend of mine who is at the border of Ukraine in Poland. And he was sharing with me the impression he got of the role technology is playing in helping manage the crisis, making sure people get the resources that they need, being connected with the agencies that can provide help. And it sparked a question. So I'll ask the question of each of the panelists. Your thoughts of how we can better use technology, provide technological resources to deliver humanitarian assistance to Syrians, and what role Congress might play in helping make sure that assistance, that technology is getting in the right places.
I could jump in here, Congressman, just briefly,
Please.
since I mentioned this in my recommendations and in my statement. There is absolutely a lot to be done in terms of education and extending education programs, primary, secondary, even college and university degrees. We have many Syrians in North Syria that are cut off from, the institutions that used to be under Assad, under the control of the Assad government. Many of those children are out of school. They are at risk for all kinds of exploitation. But we can work a lot more with technological companies. Now there's, Wi-Fi, et cetera, is being extended across from the Turkish border. There's more that can be done in the Northeast, but allowing education programs to flourish. And even kids in Assad-held areas, do and can access some online programs. And I think that we can find creative ways to work with USAID to make sure that children across all parts of Syria can access sustainable and formal education programs. I think that should definitely be a priority for us.
Great, thank you. Mr. Lang, any thoughts on the ways we can deploy technology and how Congress might help?
Sure, and technology has been absolutely essential to supplying sort of cash transfers to refugees living in Jordan and other locations in the region. This has been a tool, right, that has actually sort of facilitated a much more efficient form of cash transfer. It involves iris scan technology, and it allows aid to sort of be boutique and speak to the nature of the need that the individual has very specifically. In addition, more technology is increasingly playing a very important role with access to the labor market, right? There are a number of firms who are getting involved in helping markets clear in terms of getting Syrians access to jobs. They've done it in a number of different places in Europe and elsewhere, and sort of upping the game that technology plays and the tech companies play in helping facilitate job matching and skill transfer in the regional host countries, I think would be an exceptional opportunity. And finally, education, again, for in the overstressed systems where we have in Jordan, in Lebanon, et cetera, where there are now two phases to classes, right? In the morning and the afternoon to try to get refugee children in, facilitating access to technology and using those tools to improve Syrian children's opportunity and access to education are a big part of the way forward.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Rayburn.
Yeah, I think the Northwest does not get enough attention, Congressman. We've given, over the last few years, we've given a lot of interest, focus on the Northeast because the Defeat ISIS campaign is there. The Northwest, we essentially zeroed out a lot of U.S. assistance funding to the Northwest. It's time to rebalance that. The Northwest has more people and more territory than the country of Lebanon in the liberated territories of the Northwest, and it's time for the United States to take focused interest in that. I would suggest Congress engage with the State Department to reopen Regional Embassy Office Gaziantep, move the START team there so they can have better visibility on assistance and technological deployment into Northwest Syria. And that's a part of countering Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and those groups there, which we're not competing against. There are millions of people there who hate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, hate Al-Qaeda, hate ISIS, but they get no assistance from us the way that our allies in the Northeast do. So I think it's long overdue to have a relook at the way the United States engages with the Northwest.
Thank you. And I now have the up arrow on the timer, which either means I have unlimited time or my time is up. I'm guessing it's the latter. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schneider. Great. I will yield myself 5 minutes or additional time as I may need. Thank you very much to all of the witnesses. This is a really, really important conversation. I want to just focus on a couple of things. This has gone the way a congressional hearing should go. The conversation was specific and detailed, and my colleagues were well informed, and our witnesses are knowledgeable and do so much to help this horrific situation. But I want to try to make this. I want to take a step back and suggest that 500,000 Syrians having been slaughtered and over 12 million displaced is the equivalent of over 9 million Americans being killed and nearly 250 million Americans being displaced. We have a tendency, especially over time, especially over 11 years, to continue to focus on the specifics, sometimes losing sight because the day-to-day is so terrible. Sometimes losing sight, I think, of the enormity of the atrocities wrought on Syria by Bashar al-Assad. And so I have two questions. The first question is, you've laid out, and I'm so grateful to our witnesses, not just for being here, but for your thought leadership and for the work that you do on the ground. You've laid out a lot of specific steps that we can take to ensure that aid can be provided to address the gender issues. There's just a lot that you laid out. Here's the question. How do we continue? First, how do we get enough of a commitment to actually have the resources to do it? I think earlier 28% of the refugee plan was funded. And then how do we actually get it paid, since thus far this year that number is 0? That's question one, and I'll open that up to any of the witnesses. Who has thoughts?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
I can jump in for a second. The United States has done an extraordinary amount in terms of the funding and the leadership, right? And in no small part due to Congress, in the kind of response that we've offered both inside Syria for the humanitarian response and then also for the refugees response externally. I think part of this has to do with sharing the responsibility and marshaling others to do more as well. The Europeans have spent a tremendous amount of money, particularly in Turkey, right? And so I think there's a question about how you sort of divide. The Europeans had a 5-year program or 6-year program for, in essence, trading certain migration protocols for assistance. Now, we can have a discussion about whether or not that was the right thing to do from a protection standpoint, but largely it seems to have held. At the moment, there are only about another 1.5 years of assistance in that pipeline. So I think trying to encourage our European allies, especially as Ukraine comes online, to take the long view and to look at making a longer-term commitment in the coming years, one that we can then similarly match in countries like Jordan and then countries like Lebanon, which are going to need a tremendous amount of help. In addition, I would posit that there are certain, for example, Gulf allies who, whether or not, I mean, one of the sort of externalities of the situation in Ukraine are going to be an increase in the amount of money that's going to be made on certain oil markets. And I think it might be an opportunity for some of our Gulf allies to sort of step up and stand shoulder to shoulder with us in getting assistance to refugee populations in the region, but then also potentially inside of Syria for humanitarian assistance.
Thanks. Yeah. Yes.
Congressman, I think it's about U.S. leadership, to be honest with you. I mean, my experience as the Syria envoy was that when we showed a commitment, even if it was not a maximal commitment compared to previous years, when we showed a continued commitment, others fell in line. That was seed money, and others came to where we would lead them. We have the convening authority, the convening example. So it really is about being active. That's why I think it's so important. I wish the administration would appoint a senior diplomat to fill that envoy role, to show leadership. And I think also that diplomat could take the lead in engaging the Gulf countries, as Mr. Lang mentioned, to up their contribution as well. We had a difficult time with that during the Trump administration. That was mainly because of the Turkey Gulf rift. I think those things are improving now. There may be an opening there.
Thanks. And Ms. Schalke, I think you had wanted to say something.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I only wanted to add that we are deeply grateful for the investments the United States has made and continues to make in global development and humanitarian response, and the global response to COVID as well. And we, as an international confederation of care partners across the world, we are actively engaging governments throughout the world, in both wealthy nations and in the global south. And we consistently urge wealthy nations to contribute their fair share to global efforts. And we also seek our best to push governments in the global south to adopt policy changes that will create systematic transformational change for communities who face poverty and injustice, and of course, in the forefront of this discussion, the Syrian people. Thank you.
Thanks. And my final question is on the topic of justice and the continued importance of the pursuit of justice and accountability. How significant is that as we look ahead to the future in Syria, hopefully a future better for the people of Syria? How significant is that pursuit of justice and holding those accountable for these horrific atrocities responsible?
Congressman, I'll jump in here if you don't mind. Absolutely. I mean, I think accountability is going to be of utmost importance in the coming years. You have Syrian doctors and nurses and humanitarian workers that have been documenting all kinds of crimes that have taken place across Syria for the last decade. We have it. The IIIM has been part of this process. The Commission of Inquiry has been part of this process. You have many Syrian and international legal organizations that have kept dossiers of chemical weapons use, of attacks on hospitals, of attacks on schools. And I think right now it's really important. I mean, we've seen only a handful of trials across Europe, universal jurisdiction trials. But I think with what we're seeing now in Russia and the submission to the ICC, and the potential opening of inquiries into Russia's crime in the Ukraine, this offers us a really important moment and also a responsibility to not just hold Russia accountable for what it's done in Ukraine, which is justified, but also to widen that dossier and to look at, you have some of these same Russian generals that were involved both in crimes committed in the Ukraine and Syria that were dropping bombs on both populations. And they should be held accountable for both of those crimes so that the victims can be treated equally by a court of law.
Ms. Kadour, thank you to you and Ms. Schalke, Mr. Lang and Mr. Rayburn. We're most grateful for your participation in this hearing today. This is a really difficult time for the world, but the unity that we see as those with shared values stand together against Putin's aggression and attacks on Ukraine we have to continue to maintain that unity, and that applies to standing with the people of Ukraine, and it applies to remembering the people of Syria, just as we have over the past 11 years. We will work to ensure humanitarian assistance is provided. We will work to ensure that justice is ultimately meted out, and we will do that throughout the whole of this government, both the administration and the United States Congress, and I know from dedicated leaders, activists, and NGOs that all of you represent. Thanks very much, and I'll remind the members that if you have additional questions, you can ask witnesses to please respond to them in writing, and I ask my colleagues that any witness questions for the hearing record be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days, and with that and without objection, the hearing is adjourned. Thanks again.